Good day, everyone. I, William Wallace A. Lamberte, together with my group mates Carl Emmanuel Erfe and Adrian Clark Velos, are here to present about the Module 9 and Module 10 of Basic Occupational Safety and Health. So let's start with Module 9, which is the Personal Protective Equipment. So let's start with what is personal protective equipment. Personal protective equipment is an equipment worn to minimize exposure to hazards that cause serious workplace injuries and illnesses. The selection of PPE must comply with the existing OSH standard, and using these in the workplace must be combined with training and orientation of their proper use, limitation, and advantages. You must monitor proper usage and maintenance of PPE in order to attain satisfactory performance and properly administer the PPE program in your area of responsibility. And for the objective of Module 9, which is the personal protective equipment, is first is to distinguish the appropriate type of PPE you need in your workplace. Next is to know the limitation of PPE. And lastly is to develop programs to introduce PPE for your country. Before proceeding, let us first define hazard. What is hazard? A hazard is anything that produces adverse effect on anyone. Example of hazards are slippery floors, falling objects, chemicals, and many more. Unsafe or unhealthy acts brings out unsafe and unhealthy conditions, causing hazards in the workplace. Although some hazards are intrinsic in nature, a human hand is still behind most of the hazards we now encounter. And there are five classifications of hazards, namely, one is the direct hazard, second one is the physical hazard, the third one is the chemical hazard, next is the biological hazard, and lastly is the ergonomic hazard. First is the direct hazard. Direct hazard are very common in companies that utilize oil, water, or any liquid in the production process, and in the construction industry where there are a lot of falling debris like small pieces of wood, nails, and hand tools. Example of these are the unguarded moving parts of machines, falling or flying particles, and slippery floors. Next is the physical hazard. Physical hazard is an agent, factor, or circumstance that can cause harm with contact. And there are different kinds of physical hazard. First one is the noise. Noise is inadequate hearing protection or prolonged exposure to noise can result in either temporary or permanent hearing loss. So, the allowable exposure to noise is for 8 hours only 90 decibels, 4 hours is 95 decibels, 2 hours is 100 decibels, and for 1 hour is 105 decibels. Next is the extreme temperatures are of two types: the extreme heat, which can cause heat stroke, and extreme cold, which can cause hypothermia. Next is the extreme pressure. The extreme pressure, these are pressures beyond the allowable levels needed by the human body. Normal atmospheric pressure is 14.7 psi, and even a small change in the atmospheric pressure has a corresponding effect to humans. Examples of workers exposed to extreme pressures are those involved in excavation work, scuba diving, and piloting airplanes. Next is the radiation. Radiation also has two types, the ionizing radiation and the non-ionizing type. The types of ionizing radiations are the ultraviolet light or alpha particle from the sun can be shielded by paper. Next is the beta particle can be penetrated by paper but not concrete. Next is the gamma ray can penetrate concrete. This can be shielded by using lead like in the X-ray room which is made up of sheeted lead in between concrete to prevent outside exposure. Next is the non-ionizing radiation. The radio waves, electric waves, and infrared rays. Next type is the vibration. Vibration can cause changes in tendons, muscles, bones, and joints and can affect the nervous system. Next classification of hazard is the chemical hazard. Chemical hazard are substances in solid, liquid, or gaseous form known to cause poison, fire, explosion, or ill effects to health. Examples include gases, fumes, vapor, mist, and dust. These are airborne particles or airborne toxic elements that evaporate in the air and can cause irritation, discomfort, and even death. Chemical routes of entry to the body are by inhalation, ingestion, and skin absorption. Next is the biological hazard. A biological hazard or a biohazard is a biological substance that possesses threat to the health of living organisms, primarily humans. This could include a sample of microorganism, virus, or toxin that can adversely affect human health. Types of hazards includes viruses, toxins from biological sources, spores, fungi, pathogenic microorganisms, and bioactive substances. Lastly is the ergonomic hazard. Ergonomic hazard are physical conditions that may pose risk of injury to the musculoskeletal system, such as the muscles or ligaments of the lower back, tendons or nerves of the hand or wrists, or bones surrounding the knees, resulting in a musculoskeletal disorder. The ergonomic hazards include improperly adjusted workstation and chairs, frequent lifting, poor posture, awkward movements, especially if there are repetitive, using too much force, especially if it's done frequently, and vibrations. Next is the hazard control measures. There are three methods in controlling hazards: engineering, administrative, and PPE. First method is engineering method. Engineering method is the application of engineering technologies to control hazards. An example is machine guarding, which prevent anyone from coming in contact with moving parts of machine during the operation. Other examples are installation of safety devices like emergency stop, limit, grab wire, and photoelectric switches. This prevents accidents in case of improper work practices. Other form of engineering method involves substituting hazardous substances with less hazardous ones or substitution, and isolating hazardous process or isolation. Next is the administrative method, which aims to minimize the exposure of humans to workplace hazards and employs administrative approaches such as rotation and shifting. Lastly is the PPE. These are considered as the last line of defense. These devices provide limited protection to the ones using them. So there are programs to introduce in PPE. Once it is decided that personal protective equipment is going to be used, then the following steps need to be undertaken. First is to write a policy on the usage of PPE and communicate it to the employees and visitors as needed. Second is select the proper type of equipment. Third is the implement a thorough training program. The fourth one is to ensure that the employees know the correct use and maintenance of the equipment. And lastly is to enforce proper use of maintenance of PPE. Next is the policy. The policy should state the need for the use of PPE. It may also contain exception or limitation on the use of PPE. For the policy of selection of proper equipment, in selecting the proper protector, consideration should be given to the kind and degrees of hazard. Where a choice of protectors is given and the degree of protection required is not an important issue, workers' comfort may be a deciding factor. Next is proper training. The extent to which the personnel who must wear the equipment understand its necessity, the ease and comfort with which it can be used or work with a minimum or interference with normal work procedures. Next is the maintenance program. All equipment must be inspected periodically before and after use. A record of all inspection with the date, tabulated results, the recommendation of the manufacturer for the maintenance of the device, and the repair and replacement of parts supplied by the manufacturer of the product should be kept. Lastly is the enforcement. Employees need to know how to use PPE, and the PPE will be enforced. Many companies have some kind of disciplinary actions, such as unpaid time off and finally termination. The enforcement of the use of PPE is critical to a successful program. Next one is the uses of PPE. The first one is the head protection. A safety hat is a device that provides head protection against impact from falling objects and protections against elect- electrocution. Safety hats should be inspected prior to each use. Any one of the following defects is a cause for immediate removal of PPE from service. Suspension system that shows evidence of material cracking, tearing, frying, or other signs of deterioration. Suspension should provide a minimum clearance of 1 to 1.25 inches between the top of the worker's head and the inside crown of the hat. Any cracks of perforations of brim or shell, deformations of shell, evidence of exposure to excessive heat, chemicals or radiation. Shells, shells made of polymer plastics are susceptible to damage from ultraviolet light and gradual chemical degradation. The degradation first appears as a loss of surface gloss called chalking. With, with further deterioration, the surface will begin to flake away. Next is the eye protection. Eye protection is a device that provides eye protection from hazards caused by flying particles, sparks, light radiation, splashes, and gases. Goggles come in a number of different styles for a variety of uses such as protecting against dust and splashes, eye caps, flexible or cushioned goggles, plastic eye shield goggles, and Foundry men's goggles. Eye protectors must meet the following minimum requirements. Provide adequate protection against the particular hazard for which they are designed. Be reasonably comfortable when worn under the designated conditions. Fit snugly without interfering with the movement or vision of the wearer. Be durable, be capable of being disinfected, be easily cleaned, and lastly, be kept clean and in good conditions. Next is face shields. Face shields should only be used as eye and face protection in areas where splashing or dusts rather than impact resistance is the problem. In the case of grinding operations, a face shield is only secondary protection to other protective devices such as safety goggles. Next is the ear protection. The prevention of excessive noise exposure is the only way to avoid hearing damage. Engineering and administrative controls may be used if acceptable sound levels are exceeded. If such controls fail to reduce the sound levels to acceptable limits, personal hearing protection must be used. Ear muff must make a perfect seal around the ear to be effective. Next is the respiratory protection. Respiratory protection is required when engineering improvements and administrative controls can't eliminate risk. Engineering controls include isolation of source or contaminants, design process or procedural changes, and etc. Next is the hand and arm protection. The hand and arm protection is required when workers' hands are exposed to hazards, such as harmful substances that can be absorbed by skin, severe cuts or laceration, severe abrasion, chemical burns, thermal burns, and temperature extremes. Next one is the foot and leg protection. The foot and leg protection has two major parts. The conductive shoes protect protect against the buildup of static electricity or equalize the electrical potential between personnel and the ground. Next is the electrical hazard safety shoes. The electrical hazard safety shoes are non-conductive and protect against circuit of 600 volts or less under dry conditions. Another one is the fall protection. The fall protection has major parts which are the travel resistant system. Travel resistant system is an assembly composed of body belt and proper accessories that prevent a worker in a high elevation working area from traveling to an edge where the occurrence of fall may happen. Next is the fall arrest system. Fall arrest system is an assembly composed of full body harness, safety lanyard, and proper accessories of or a safety net which protect a worker after a fall by stopping the fall before hitting the surface below. Next is the lifelines. Lifelines shall be secured above the point of operation to an anchored or other structural members. Next is the torso or full body protection. Torso or full body protection must be provided by an employee if they are threatened with bodily injured or one kind or another while performing their jobs, and if engineering work practices and administrative controls have failed to eliminate these hazards. Next is the Rule 1080. The Rule 1080 of the Occupational Safety and Health Standards requires employers to provide appropriate personal protective equipment to workers. Employers can be held liable if they fail to furnish their workers with the necessary PPE. Rule 1080 General Provision 1080.01 Every employer shall at his or her own expense furnish his or her workers with protective equipment for the eyes, face, hands, and feet, protective shields and barriers whenever necessary by reasons of the hazardous nature of the process or environment, chemicals or radiological or other mechanical irritants or hazards capable of causing injury or impairment in the function of any part of the body through absorption, inhalation, or physical contact. Next is the 1081.02. All protective equipment shall be of approved design and construction appropriate for the exposure and the work to be performed. Next is the 1081.03. The employer shall be responsible for the ad- adequacy and proper maintenance of personal protective equipment used in this workplace. Next is the 1081.04. No person shall be subjected or exposed to hazardous environmental conditions without protection. And that should be all. Thank you and God bless.